The victims of America's worst mass shooting are being sued. Spraying gunfire from the Mandalay Bay Hotel in Las Vegas, a gunman killed dozens and injured hundreds more. Now the hotel is filing suit against the survivors. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the lawsuit against the Vegas victims. The hotel that Stephen Paddock used as a base to shoot and kill dozens of people and injure hundreds more has filed a first-of-its-kind lawsuit against some of Paddock's victims. MGM Resorts International hopes its legal action will shield the company from liability. Survivors and relatives of the victims have already sued or threatened to sue the hotel group, accusing it of negligence and failing to provide adequate security. But under a post-9/11 federal law, MGM is arguing it's not liable, in part because it employed security services vetted by the U.S. government. So is MGM right to file the lawsuit, or is it only adding insult to injury? Christine Purovolakis reports.
Run! Keep your head down! You been shot? I need 911. No, one in the chest here.
At least 58 people now dead.
We are talking about the largest mass shooting in the history of the United States.
Victims of the Las Vegas shooting are now being sued by the hotel where the massacre took place.
It enrages me to think that this company can just try to skip out on their responsibilities and their liability for what happened.
MGM Resorts International has filed lawsuits against more than 1,000 survivors and relatives of the 58 people shot dead by gunman Stephen Paddock on the Las Vegas Strip last October. Paddock opened fire on people attending a sold-out music festival from the upper floors of MGM's Mandalay Bay Hotel, where he booked a suite. Many of those victims have since filed lawsuits in a number of states, including California, Nevada, and New York, accusing MGM of negligence in the attack. They say the hotel failed to notice the shooter was stockpiling weapons in his room. Joyce Shipp's daughter was one of the victims.
We didn't know she was dead for like almost 3 days. She was one of the last people to be identified. The fact that they're trying to sue us now, or they are suing us, it's outrageous.
MGM argues it has no liability for any deaths or injuries under the Safety Act. The Safety Act was passed after 9/11 and limits a company's liability in the event of a terrorist attack if they use security services certified by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Over the last 16 years, airports, stadiums, and sports teams are among those having received security certification. The security firm that MGM Resorts hired that night was certified. However, the FBI is unsure why Stephen Paddock opened fire on 22,000 people at the concert. As his motive is unknown, the mass shooting cannot be classified as an act of terrorism. MGM's lawsuit has angered many of the survivors and the relatives still grieving for those who died. And if MGM is successful, many fear it could pave the way for more companies to seek protection from lawsuits after mass shootings. Christine Purovolakis, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this further, I'm joined from Claremont, California, by Catherine Lombardo. She is an attorney representing some of the victims of the Las Vegas shooting. In Washington, we have Henry Sue. He's a partner at the Constantine Cannon Law Firm, which specializes in commercial litigation. And from Denver, Colorado, Thomas Russell. He is a law professor at Sturm College of Law at the University of Denver. Thanks all three so much for joining us. Thomas Russell, let me start with you. I mean, suing the victims, I know it sounds horrible, but do you think MGM could have found a legitimate approach to actually protection from litigation here?
I think this is a bit of a ham-fisted effort by MGM. The goal that they've described is to consolidate the suits in one courtroom, and that's something that they could accomplish through other mechanisms. In a letter that the CEO, Jim Murren, sent 4 days ago to employees, he says that was their only goal. But of course, other goals include shifting responsibility to the vendor of security services, reducing the total amount of damages that people can complain about, and also eliminating them. So I think there are certainly other ways. Multi-district litigation would be one possibility that MGM might have accomplished the goal that they allege is there. I might say, though, one of the things about MGM is that in this litigation, I do regard them as one of the victims as well, and I think that that is something that perhaps we should keep in mind.
As one of the victims, I mean, so having said that, why couldn't they just use the post-9/11 law they're proposing as part of their defense instead of making themselves the plaintiff in this case?
I think they could have, and I think legally they should have, and certainly from a public relations standpoint, they should have done that. I mean, it's to be hit with a lawsuit or served with a suit if they've indeed gone out and served people is a pretty frightening thing. So this sort of preemptive shot across the bow does strike me as a little bit unusual. They might have just waited, pushed to consolidate suits together, and then also push them into one particular federal court. That would have been a better approach, probably. On the other hand, being a plaintiff in personal injury litigation is extremely difficult emotionally, and all of the plaintiffs can expect that their medical histories and their emotional histories will be gone through with fine-tooth combs. So to the extent that this is a horrible thing, it's just one of many horrible things that plaintiffs in personal injury litigation face.
Henry, Sue, let me ask you, I mean, people could argue this is kind of a novel approach, but you think it does very serious damage, as Thomas actually agrees, to the hotel's reputation. What are the costs for MGM there?
Well, I just think that, you know, for a company that's in the hospitality entertainment industries, you know, so much of its business depends on word of mouth and goodwill. And when you're suing as many people as MGM has, you have to expect that there will be a lot of social media traffic, you know, much of it negative to the company for months to come, for as long as the litigation is going on, and that this will continue to be picked up in the news. So it isn't simply a crisis that, you know, blows over and, you know, turns quiet. It's going to be something that's going to be of continuing interest to the public.
Then let me get your opinion on why you think a lawyer would choose this path.
Well, I have to obviously, you know, give some credit to the lawyers for MGM. They've thought about this, and as the professor has said, you know, one of their stated interests here is in trying to consolidate and manage what could be potentially, you know, hundreds of lawsuits around the country and in various state courts around the country. And what they're trying to do is to use this federal statute to get the matter into federal court, where the rules and procedures are much more, you know, uniform, and they can expect, you know, to have a way for the federal courts to coordinate this type of case.
Okay, let me get to Catherine. Catherine, I'd like to get first your response as to what Thomas had to say about the hotel actually being a victim in this case as well. Why are you suing the hotel on behalf of the clients you're representing?
Well, I think that that's an untrue statement, and it couldn't be further from the truth. My clients and the 22,000 victims who were attending the Route 91 Harvest Festival country concert on October 1st of 2017 were innocent victims. This could have been prevented. We know more now than we ever did, and we know how strongly now that what we've been saying all along is true and will be proven in a court of law, that this could have been prevented. The shooter spent many days in that hotel room up on the 32nd floor. He brought his arsenal of weapons and ammunition and power tools and tools and supplies up to the 32nd floor over a 3 or 4 day period, perhaps even a 5-day period.
But Catherine, let me cut to the chase there. What did Mandalay Bay Hotel fail to do in this case that all the other hotels would have done that make Mandalay Bay personally responsible here? No other hotel had these security mechanisms in place.
They would have caught it. You see, ever since 9/11, there has been training provided to all of the casinos and the hotels in Las Vegas because Las Vegas is at the top of the list for a potential terrorist attack. And so the Department of Homeland Security and the department named before that was created have been training all of the security companies throughout Las Vegas and the hotels, providing them with active shooter training, terrorist attack training. This training included training on how to identify a potential threat. There are indicators of when a person could be a threat, could potentially be an active shooter, just like this shooter was, this murderer was. They missed it. Not only did they miss it, they turned a blind eye because this shooter was a high roller in the casinos. He'd been there many times. They knew him. He brought in all of this heavy equipment, weapons, guns, ammunition, and he tipped the bellhops, the valet guys. They carried in his weapons for him. They removed them from his car, put it on a cart, walked through the casino, took it into the back service elevator, up to the 32nd floor, brought it to his room, and unloaded it for him, where he spent the next couple of days setting up his trajectory, preparing, planning. They never went into his room to clean it. At some point, a maid did go in, but he hadn't had his arsenals out. He was hiding them. But you see, they could have and should have noticed this. Now, MGM has been saying that this was a first time this has ever happened, that this was unforeseeable. They're wrong. Not only was it foreseeable, but it was foreseen because they were preparing for this. They should have prepared for this. And just 3 years prior to this shooting, the exact same thing was about to take place. Another active shooter had gone up to the higher floors and set up his rifles and his arsenal pointed at the Las Vegas Strip, ready to shoot innocent victims walking down the Strip. A maid had come in and she saw it. She called the police and the FBI. That person was criminally prosecuted. MGM has made that hush-hush. Not only did they make it hush-hush, but in the court filing, they told the judge that nothing like this had ever happened before.
Catherine, I'd like to get back to Thomas here then, because Thomas, you had said that the hotel, in a sense, was also a victim. Now, hearing how strong of a case Catherine has put forward, you would have to expect MGM to look for very novel ways of trying to fight this, because it sounds very clear from what Catherine is setting forth that MGM doesn't have a chance in not being proven somewhat liable for this massacre.
That's right. That's right.
Well, I mean, judges and juries decide about facts, so the challenge for the plaintiff's attorney here is to establish that the hotel acted unreasonably, and I absolutely agree that the evidence that we've just heard there is compelling. When I say that MGM is a victim as well, one of the things that we do in tort litigation is we sort of balance the relative causation of the various parties. So the question is going to be, to what extent is the shooter responsible for this? To what extent is the hotel responsible for this? To what extent is the security company that provided security down on the ground? To what extent does that liability split between different entities of MGM? So that's the simple point, that of course having a shooter in your hotel, damages the reputation, and then MGM further damages their reputation with how they're handling this litigation. So, I think the plaintiffs will bring forth that evidence. And again, in the face of that, this invocation of the Safety Act tries to eliminate elements of the harm that the clients have suffered here, that the injured people have suffered, and tries to shift that literally downstream or down on the ground to the insurance company that insured the company that provided security services or took tickets or whatever they did on the ground. It's a little unclear from MGM's filing.
Okay, Catherine, go ahead, and then let me get to Henry.
It's reprehensible what MGM has done by suing my clients and the victims. I expect that they're going to sue in every single state in the United States. And it's wrong, it's reprehensible, it's also unprecedented. And it's a case that's never been tried before, the Safety Act invocation, and it's wrong. The Safety Act does not apply to this scenario and this particular shooting. The Safety Act was not designed for this scenario and this shooting. The Safety Act authors did not have this in mind. You see, MGM is trying to say, we can't be sued, Judge, and we want you to make a ruling that says we just can't be sued. We are not liable at all for any of the victims in any way whatsoever. That's exactly what they wrote in their court filings to the judge. They're putting the blame on a yellow T-shirt security company that was hired to, like he says, take tickets and kind of manage the crowd. This yellow T-shirt security company had nothing to do with MGM's security and allowing the shooter, Stephen Paddock, to wreak havoc and murder and shoot at 22,000 people. That's all on Mandalay Bay and MGM. They cannot shift the blame.
Okay, let me point that to Henry then, because that is a major part of MGM's case here, in that they say they hired a security company that had been vetted by Homeland Security, and that it was their job to ensure the safety of those thousands of people at this venue. Do you think there's any legitimacy to that?
Well, I think it goes, to the facts that Catherine has recounted, and to Thomas's comments about, the jury and the judge figuring out, how to apportion the responsibility here. I would say that, yes, MGM may have hired a security company to handle the security on the grounds on the night of the concert, but the question is, what did they do in the days before, and what steps could they have taken, as Catherine has suggested, to identify Mr. Paddock as a potential threat? So that's one question. I would also note, Thomas was talking about liability, and one of the concepts in tort law is what we call proximate cause. In other words, figuring out what action or what omission was the root cause of this incident. And the Safety Act has that requirement of proximate cause. That is, it says that the seller of the technology, in this case the security company, is liable only if it was the proximate cause of the incident.
Okay.
And so just because you can sue the security company doesn't mean necessarily that MGM isn't also jointly responsible, or even more responsible if there was an opportunity, for instance, to identify the shooter in the days before the concert.
Thomas, go ahead quickly. I saw you had a response, and then I need to ask Catherine something else. Go ahead, Thomas.
Just quickly, I agree with I agree with Mr. Sue's point there, and analytically, I conceive of it as an event on the ground and then also a hotel. And although I know MGM owns all of those entities, even if the Safety Act provided some kind of narrowing of damages for the events on the ground, it's not clear to me why it should insulate the MGM's actions in Mandalay Hotel at all from scrutiny. So I think that in that way, the filing that I read didn't make any sense.
Okay, Catherine, let me ask you. I mean, we're focusing on the responsibility of the hotel here, but actually your case is going after other parties involved. And from the outside, I mean, remember, we're catering to an international audience here as well. They look at this and say, this is an American problem specific to the United States, whereby gun manufacturers, those bump stocks manufacturers as well, are really the ones that should be held responsible for producing weapons that are meant to kill absurd numbers of people at a time. Why is it that a hotel has to assume responsibility and not more is put on the gun manufacturers and those who made the weapons that killed these dozens of innocents?
Well, because that's the law here. And we are not suing the manufacturers of the guns or the bump stocks. They are not included defendants. In fact, they are, for the most part, immune from liability and from being sued. And that's just the law. The law of negligence is well established. It's been tested and tried and reasserted for decades after decades of judicial scrutiny. The law of negligence is what rules here. And here in America, in the United States, in Nevada, in California, that law is what allows the victims to file a lawsuit, because when you are a guest in a hotel, you are expected to be protected by that hotel. And here, the MGM Mandalay Bay, which is owned by MGM, they failed to protect these 22,000 people who paid money. Now, keep in mind that the concert venue, the pavement where they were standing in the concert underneath the hotel, was owned by Mandalay Bay and MGM. In fact, the entire event, the permit that was taken out from the city and the county was taken out and applied for and signed by MGM executives.
Okay.
And they know it.
But we are aware that there are victims that are actually suing the bump stocks manufacturers, because that...
Not anymore. No.
Has that been dropped?
Yes, I believe so. There were a few lawsuits originally throughout the country, but that has been dropped. We've all of the lawyers throughout the country have all joined together. We are a united force. We are a united front. In fact, just 5 days ago, we had a very, very huge meeting in Las Vegas together. We are all on the same page and presenting a very, very strong, united prosecution against MGM, which, by the way, if I can state, I think it was Thomas who talked about why MGM filed this was to try to coordinate or consolidate all of the lawsuits. No, that's not necessary. We are already coordinated and consolidated, and the judge will know that in just a few days. So there is no need for that. They're doing this. It's a ploy. It's a tactic. It's a dirty trick, and it's a PR nightmare for MGM. I can't believe they did this. I don't know who made the decision to do this.
We'll see how this unfolds in court. Thomas, very unfortunately, I can't give you a final word. I know you had a comment there, but we are completely out of time for this segment of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of you so much for joining us. Still to come on the Newsmakers, Kenya demolishes the homes of 30,000 people to make way for a new highway. Were the evictions illegal? And a Kuwaiti blogger faces an intense backlash for attacking new laws aimed at improving working conditions for Filipinos. Well, cranes and bulldozers recently demolished part of Kenya's largest slum overnight, leaving about 30,000 people homeless. The government says it warned residents in Kibera the area would be cleared in order to finish construction of a highway in the capital, Nairobi. Well, people were given 2 weeks' notice to leave, and said authorities promised to resettle them. Legal challenges were filed against the planned demolition, but in one case, a judge ruled building the highway was in the public interest. Amnesty International calls the forced evictions tragic and illegal, but the government says it's the people who lived in the slum who were breaking the law. Let's take a closer look.
Early this morning, while we were still sleeping, we heard the trucks destroying property and we rushed out. Most of my things have been destroyed. I don't know where to go with my children.
Joining me now from Nairobi is Irungu Houghton. He is the Executive Director of Amnesty International Kenya, and also from Nairobi, Peter Ngao. He is the urban planner behind the highway project and an associate professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Nairobi. Thanks both so much for joining us. Irungu, I'd like to start with you. In this case, is the government foregoing the interest and well-being of its most vulnerable people really just in favor of development, or does this highway better serve the greater good?
I mean, I think from our perspective as Amnesty International, we were very concerned with the way that the evictions were carried out last week. They have all the traits of a forced eviction. The process was initiated and at the negotiation of the community and the Kenyan National Commission for Human Rights, there was an agreement to do an enumeration process to list all the persons that would be affected by this project, and that process began in earnest. But unfortunately, before the Kenya Urban Roads Authority could come back to the community and the Kenya National Commission for Human Rights, the bulldozers rolled into Kibera, and 3 days later, we had 2,000 households essentially smashed to the ground, with about 10,000 people basically homeless. It knocked down at least 5 schools and damaged 2 other schools, several community health centers, and also a number of religious places of worship. So in very many ways, this was a very bad example of how to remove people from a road reserve in order to build or to upgrade a road.
Peter, let me ask you, was there a better way for the government to go about this?
The road was planned in 1970s. The area which was demolished was a road reserve. I would say that during 80s and 90s, people settled on that area, that's the Kibera slums. And of course, the idea was, like Irungu said, there should have been a negotiated way of getting the people notice and giving them an alternative site so that they settle, so that the road can be done. The road is a legal project, and I think it has been mentioned already. The representatives of the community and the road authority and the National Land Commission met. I understand a enumeration was carried out between 16th and 20th, and agreement was expected to come. Whether the agency moved fast before settling the people, that is something which I think has not been clarified.
Okay, then let me ask Irungu. I mean, the government says that it followed the necessary court process. So where is the disconnect here? I mean, how can you have families suddenly woken up in the early hours of the morning to hear bulldozers outside and having to run out of their homes and watch their neighborhood be demolished if the government says it followed processes necessarily?
I'm not sure which processes and which laws they would be referring to, but in Kenya we have essentially one law, which is the Internally Displaced Persons Act of 2012. We also have guidelines on legal evictions. We are also signatories to very many international human rights instruments. And as far as we can see, and I was in Kibera as the bulldozers knocked down several homes, none of that was followed. In that moment, we essentially saw very expensive tippers, excavators and bulldozers, and about 600 police officers, but no single education officer, no single councillor, no single housing officer providing alternative information on where people could go for housing, or where the children that were now no longer able to go to their schools, where they would be relocated to. So in many ways, I think there are many lessons that the government must learn from the Kibera experience. Kibera is one of our oldest and probably most famous urban settlements. It is essentially a catchment area for a lot of urban-rural migration, as Peter has said. And although the road reserve was essentially set aside in the 70s, the absence of government infrastructure or modernization of that area has seen a lot of encroachment by communities. And it's not one of the only suburbs with this problem. There are many neighborhoods that are currently living, I think something like 60% of the population of Nairobi live on similar circumstances as we have in Kibra.
I mean, Peter, do you think there is an issue here when it comes down to those final moments and we accept that there are so many thousands of people living in so-called illegal settlements that the government just ends up running roughshod over the rights of its most vulnerable citizens?
I would say that first to comment the civil society groups like Kenya National Commission of Human Rights and Amnesty International, because in fact they did intervene. On 10th they called for a meeting, and the meeting involved the road authority, and that's why the idea of enumeration and the resettlement was discussed. So I think that first of all it averted worse scenario. In terms of this area, the road is meant to benefit the larger Nairobi, but I believe also with the support of the civil society, they can also look at how this road will benefit the neighborhood. We need to understand that in an informal settlement, about 90% of the people living there are actually tenants. And the structures belong to a very small percentage of landlords. Now, when the discussion with the National Land Commission was going on, the National Land Commission made it very clear that they would only compensate the structure owners, not the tenants. So I think, again, it needs to be clarified. This is different from a rural setting. It's an urban setting where we have tenants and we have structure owners.
Okay, Peter, let me put this to you, though, because there has been a lot of criticism that the government prefers to build highways that tend to benefit the wealthier people that own cars and private transport, rather than investing in the public transport that could equally benefit everyone, but not so much private investment and the already wealthy members of Kenyan society. What do you make of that?
To an extent, yes, much of the road building in Nairobi has focused on the motorized vehicle, side of the transport. We are beginning to see discussions in planning talking about mass transport or mass road transport, which will be very useful. The other thing, of course, is in the design of the plans, we need more stakeholders to play a part, because you find a road is passing through a neighborhood and there is very little even interlinkage of the local roads. That needs to be improved. And I think I can say that, the city is just growing. It is not a very old city, but we need to improve on how we do some of these infrastructure projects.
Irungu, is that true? Is a lack of good urban planning a major part of the problem here?
I mean, Peter Gao is one of our foremost urban planners in this country. He knows this better than I do, but we have a number of plans that just don't get implemented. We have a lot of bylaws that don't get enforced. So much of the problem, like everywhere else in the world, essentially is not the shortage of ideas. It's really the shortage of political will to implement them. And I think from Amnesty, we would basically argue that whether it be gentrification, whether it be modernization, or whether it be large infrastructure projects, they have to benefit the large mass of people that are below the poverty line. Because if you don't do that, you are essentially just displacing slums, or as I prefer to call them, urban neighborhoods that have no security of tenure. So I think that, for me, is the way forward, is essentially dialogue, public participation, and consultation, and also a commitment that you are not going to displace communities. That has no place in a democratic society. I think, walking in Kibra in the last week or so, I was asked several times by the Kibran residents, are we children, are we Kenyans of a lesser God? And I had no answer, except to say that they have rights like all of us.
I mean, Peter, that is really the question here. How can urban planners like yourself start accommodating the country's millions of poor and homeless residents? They can't just be wished away and constantly displaced. They need to be somewhere, and planning needs to be done around where they need to reside.
I would say that the government, as of late, has started paying great attention to people of low income housing. We have what now in Kenya we call the Big Four. One of them is affordable housing. And there are efforts by government to really pay attention to this segment of society. It has been an economic challenge because as the country has developed, urbanization has moved faster than the way the country would provide jobs, would provide housing. This is a tragedy of rapid urbanization which is taking place. And I think the efforts by the government, which we are now seeing, with the, of course, support of other partners, civil society groups, I expect things will improve in the coming years. We have had some models of housing which have not been very successful. We have had government housing projects which have largely gone to the middle class. And I believe that in the planning of affordable housing in the new era now, some of these mistakes are going to be looked at.
Okay, but let me ask if these mistakes can really make or break the country, because Irungu, the truth is, Peter described them just there as segments of society. They're not really segments of society. These are huge, huge populations that are actually equivalent to the populations of major cities. This is urgent.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we've been talking about Nairobi for the last few minutes, but I think the lessons need to be learned for the other 47 capitals of our counties. And if we don't get it right in Nairobi, which has, yes, the biggest population, a population of upwards of 4 to 5 million people, we're likely to export this inhumane practice to various other cities. I think this morning I saw a number of the Kibra residents and residents from at least 10 other settlements rush to court to try and file an injunction over what looks like could be another 10 evictions over the next 2 weeks. And I think for those of us in civil society, and particularly as Amnesty International, we are calling on the government to stop, to basically announce a moratorium on forced evictions, to allow communities to be enumerated, to set up resettlement action plans, and allow people to relocate to other places rather than simply the destruction and the state violence that we have seen. Just one last image, perhaps for your viewers, and that is the image of this space where there used to be 2,000 households. To the left of that space, there is a golf course where you have maybe 5 or 6 people playing golf on a landmass that is maybe 10, 15 times bigger than the road reserve that was taken on last week.
Peter, there had been complaints about that instead of building across the golf course that so few people are able to afford and enjoy, the planners chose to build a highway across the residences of thousands of people.
As I've said, this road was reserved in 1970s. It's part of Nairobi's system of roads to make mobility better in Nairobi. Nairobi experiences extremely, big traffic jams, and it's all because everybody has to converge to the CBD to go everywhere. And now the idea of ring roads, the idea of bypasses, I think one cannot really quarrel with that one. The question is, of course, this idea of evictions. Nobody really supports evictions. And I think, actually, to the credit of civil society, from 2000, government has not been carrying out evictions or demolition of slums, except when there is a road to be done. So the current engagement between civil society and road agencies on how to go about it, I think guided by the law, which is the Internally Displaced People's Act, it should be the one which we should follow.
Okay, Irungu, let me finish with this. Do you fear, actually, on the global scale, that the plight of these people will actually just be forgotten? Because this is a global issue, and in countless countries now, we are seeing the further and further marginalization of the world's desperately poor.
I would like to be optimistic and hope that those in government would really reach out. And, you know, just to give you an example, 2 days after we held a press conference to condemn the forced evictions, the Education Ministry announced that they would look for alternative schooling for the children, the 2,500 children who were displaced. But there was no way to find them because essentially they hadn't bothered, no government agency had bothered to be able to list where the children were, which schools they went to, what ages they were, and what classes they were going to. And therefore what we have essentially is a knee-jerk response to what is, I think, a moral question. But no ability to be able to manage that. So in the case of the 10 neighborhoods that are about to be bulldozed in the next 2 weeks, one of the things we would be calling upon the state to do is to do its due diligence, to actually go in, enumerate or list the persons to be affected by the project and have the conversation with them about relocation. I think the worst that a democratic society should experience is really involuntary relocation. That is where you are relocated against your will, but at least you are given an option. The concept of forced eviction is not a concept that a democratic society can uphold.
Okay, Irungu, I will have to give you the last word because unfortunately we're out of time for this segment of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank you and Peter so much for joining us there from Nairobi.
How can you have a servant in the house that keeps their passport? What if she takes her passport and leaves? Not only that, every week they have to have a day off. A day off every week. To be honest, I don't agree with these contracts for the Filipinos.
A Kuwaiti blogger who'd been sponsored by international beauty brands has been heavily criticized after filming herself complaining about new laws that protect the rights of Filipino workers. Instagram star Sondos Alcatan attacked changes that give domestic workers the right to keep their passports and get at least 1 day off per week. The law is aimed at ending a diplomatic dispute that began earlier this year. Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte banned Filipino citizens from working in Kuwait after a Filipina maid was killed and her body found in a freezer. And Manila's ambassador to Kuwait was expelled after Philippine embassy staff helped workers escape the country following alleged mistreatment. Well, to get more on this, I'm joined now from Geneva by Claire Hobden. She is an officer with the International Labor Organization's Vulnerable Workers Division. Thanks so much for joining us, Claire. I first want to get your take on Sondos Alcatan's response to the efforts to protect Filipino workers, because she's not alone in believing that employers, for example, have the right to keep a free person's passport and that they should be expected to work 7 days a week if their room and board is being supplied by their employer. How do you address that? Is that fair for them to have that mentality?
Well, I think that's a very good question. What I think the situation is currently in Kuwait is that they have recently passed legislation in the last few years that extended certain key protections to migrant domestic workers, including a minimum wage and including the right to a day of rest. And this was a big change, I think, for society. The response that you hear is, as you said, she's not alone in feeling this way, but we are also trying to keep an eye on the overall opinions in the country, and it also seems that there is quite a lot of response against that perspective. So there is a growing population within Kuwait, I think, that is saying that it's actually absolutely fair for a domestic worker to keep her passport and to have the right to a day of rest. So as much as her comments have provoked some, or that they reflect to some degree the perspective within society, there's also a big voice that's coming out against it.
Okay, but it is slowly coming out against it. And for some of these workers, it can be somewhat urgent. Some of them have been abused, they have been exploited. How do you work on changing that mentality as quickly as possible, so that these workers are fairly treated and also treated under international conventions that protect their rights as laborers?
Well, indeed, the ILO adopted an international standard on domestic work in 2011, Convention 189 on decent work for domestic workers. And this convention, the spirit of this convention is that domestic workers should have the same rights as other workers. In this sense, the labor legislation and the rights of domestic workers in countries around the world is still falling very short of that standard. We think that there are only about 10% of domestic workers that enjoy rights equal to other workers around the world. Certainly in countries where there is no legislation or where legislation is very recent, you see a lot of situations of abuse, you see a lot of exploitation, and a lack of compliance with new laws.
Why?
I think in the case of...
I just have to ask, I mean, why are they falling short of meeting those standards? Is there a sense of entitlement among some of the wealthier people in these countries that they have a right to this domestic service and there isn't a need to adhere to international labor law?
The ones that are held accountable to international labor standards are governments. So when they ratify a convention, they are held to those standards. Kuwait has not ratified the convention, so in that sense they are not held to that international standard. However, the International Labor Convention on Domestic Work was adopted by an overwhelming majority of countries when it was adopted. So it does indicate that this is a standard that the world is progressively trying to live up to. In the case of countries where most domestic workers are migrants, where there are private recruitment agencies that are bringing them into the country from countries of lesser means, they do tend to charge households, so they charge employers a very high fee for recruiting domestic workers. This does give the feeling that an employer might see the domestic worker as an investment, and this investment is not necessarily insured. So if a domestic worker runs away, the employer loses their investment and then they have to reinvest to hire another domestic worker. So it's true that in a sense there's a certain set of policy conditions that make it such that an employer might feel a sense of entitlement over the life of a domestic worker, which sort of explains to some extent why an employer would want to keep the domestic worker's passport, why they would want to prevent them from leaving the house. But it doesn't change the fact that these are practices that contribute to situations of forced labor. So it's not a behavior that is excusable.
And it's not just the governments that have to address these issues here. There's also an industry behind migrant labor. There are private agencies that send migrant laborers over from India, from Pakistan, from the Philippines and other countries. How much are they responsible for overseeing the well-being of the people that contract them as an agent?
The International Labor Organization, as you surely know, is tripartite. So we believe very much that the government, employers' organizations, and workers' organizations all have a role to play in achieving social justice and decent work. So absolutely, enterprises that have a role in recruiting and placing migrant domestic workers, whether across borders or within a given country, do have a certain amount of responsibility to ensure that the human rights of these domestic workers are being respected. On the other hand, governments also have a role to play in adopting policies that monitor and ensure that these recruitment agencies are complying with regulations. So there is a shared responsibility that needs to take place, a policy framework that clearly identifies what the responsibilities of the agency are, what the responsibilities of the household is, and also a broader policy for providing the types of care services and cleaning services that these households are contracting on the labor market.
Okay.
So across the board,
right.
I think
but
a lot
Claire,
of different activities.
Final question, can you give us some sort of time scale for when these migrant workers will cease to be at the sometimes arbitrary mercy of their employers with no recourse for protection?
Well, it's definitely difficult to put a timeline on it, but it does seem clear to me that in countries around the world, the big challenge is that there is this pervasive social norm that domestic workers are not real workers. It requires change really at the household level across millions of households worldwide, so it will take time. But moments like this, where somebody has spoken out and taken a position that is very controversial, and it's opened up debate, and it has also given way to, shed light on this other group of people that are also saying, no, it's our responsibility as household employers to ensure decent work for the domestic workers who work in our homes. And this is a really critical opportunity for every actor involved, for workers' organizations, employers, and the government to push forward and take a jump forward, hopefully, in ensuring that the rights of domestic workers don't just exist in law, but also in practice.
Okay. Claire Hobden joining us there from Geneva. Thanks so much for that. That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, we look at the results of Zimbabwe's first election since Robert Mugabe left office. Is this a new dawn for the country? Until then, thanks for watching. Goodbye.